This is the Argument Ninja Podcast, Episode 3. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Argument Ninja Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Delaplante, and I'm a philosopher and critical thinking educator. You can go to argumentninja.com to learn more about this podcast, my background, and my other online projects, including the Critical Thinker Academy, which hosts over 20 hours of video tutorials on a wide range of topics related to logic, argumentation, and critical thinking. I'm using this podcast, whose full title is Become an Argument Ninja, as a platform for me to work out some new ideas on how to combine principles of good argumentation with principles of effective persuasion that are grounded in our best current understanding of how human beings actually form beliefs and make decisions. The skill set that results from this integration, this merger, is what I'm calling rational persuasion. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do with this show is develop the outlines for a program of instruction in the art and science and ethics of rational persuasion. Now, what's the connection between rational persuasion and the title of the podcast? Well, this expression, Argument Ninja, is a little tongue-in-cheek. Obviously, I'm drawing on the recent trendy use of ninja to refer to any technique or strategy that is very effective and that is usually only known to practitioners with a lot of skill and experience. Like if you Google ninja tips or ninja tricks, you'll get hits like 10 tips for the work-at-home ninja, how to become a Photoshop ninja, ninja tips for healthy living, and so on. So I'm using Argument Ninja in this loose way to refer to effective argumentation and persuasion techniques that are only known to a select few. But I'm not just using it in this loose colloquial way. As I'm articulating this conception of rational persuasion, I've found myself pushing a martial arts analogy. And in the last episode, episode 2, I shared some reasons for taking seriously this idea that we should treat rational persuasion as a martial art, not just figuratively, but literally. Now, in this episode, episode 3, I want to introduce another important element to our discussion of rational persuasion. This is the ethics of persuasion, the morality of using persuasion techniques to achieve your goals. We can ask this question independent of argumentation, and it'll probably help to do that at the start. Is it ever morally okay to use your knowledge of the psychology of persuasion to get another person to do what you want them to do or to believe what you want them to believe? That's the general persuasion question. When talking about persuasion and argumentation, the question is this. If I'm giving you an argument that is intended to persuade you to accept a conclusion, is it ever morally acceptable for me to use my knowledge of the psychology of persuasion to influence how you respond to my argument, to make you more inclined to accept it than you otherwise would be? Now, I'm going to need an answer to this because what I'm trying to develop in this show is an approach to argumentation that integrates the standard logic-based principles of good argumentation with psychological principles of effective persuasion. And it would be a bad start for me if it turned out that there is no morally acceptable way of doing this. Now, to help understand why there's any moral issue at all, let me clarify how the kind of persuasion that I'm talking about works. The persuasion techniques that I'm talking about involve the intentional use of our knowledge of human nature for the purpose of manipulating the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors of people at an unconscious level. If you prefer, we can call it intentional unconscious persuasion. Now, the shorthand that I've sometimes used for this is mind control. I know the term mind control is a loaded term in the sense that it's almost always used to convey something negative or sinister, so I have to be careful how I use it. But I don't want to prejudge the issue, and I'm not defining this kind of persuasion as inherently good or bad. I also want to note that these techniques aren't exotic or mysterious. You don't have to understand theoretical psychology or the cognitive mechanisms underlying the techniques to learn how to use them effectively. Many effective influence strategies are embedded in the tips and tricks that people learn when they're learning a job that involves persuasion, like learning to be a salesperson or learning to be a courtroom lawyer. Restaurant servers, for example, learn early on that a short, friendly conversation with a customer can increase the size of the tip they get. Many restaurants leave small gratuities with the bill, like a mint or a chocolate, as a matter of policy, knowing that doing so is correlated with larger tips. I remember an episode of the TV show South Park that illustrated this kind of training. The scene is set in a restaurant named Raisins, inspired by the Hooters restaurant chain, and all the young girl servers are named after sports cars: Porsche, Mercedes, Ferrari, etc. In this clip, it's Ferrari's first day, and Mercedes goes over the basics with her. Here's the clip.
Okay, I know it's your first day, Ferrari, so I want to go over the basics with you. Okay. First of all, there's a 5-foot rule. If you come within 5 feet of a customer, you need to acknowledge them, even if they're not at your table. Hey, cutie! When you're not serving food or talking with customers, you need to dance around and have fun. We have things like hula hoops, silly strings, and water guns to play with the other girls. Be sure to giggle a lot, and be sure to show off your raisins. Now, when you take a customer's order, you need to sit down at the table with them. It makes them think you're interested. Write your name down for them and make them feel special. Oh man, I am so bored. Thank God you guys came in. If you want good tips, the most important thing is physical contact. Just a simple hold of the arm can be the difference between $5 and $20. I'll be right back with your order, guys. Wow, thank you so much, Mercedes. Okay, well, I guess we're ready to open for business. Good luck. Go ahead and open for business, Portia. Okay.
These techniques work so well that in this episode, one of the characters, Butters, falls in love with one of the servers because he thinks the attention he's getting at the restaurant is sincere. Principles of effective persuasion are learned through experience and passed down through training and mentorship without having to be framed in the language of neuropsychology and cognitive science. Indeed, in many contexts, we don't think of these practices as manipulative in any negative sense. We may think of an effective salesperson simply as good with people, not a mind controller. So my first piece of critical thinking advice on this issue is to distinguish the descriptive issue of what does or does not constitute unconscious psychological persuasion from the normative issue of whether any particular instance of such persuasion is good or bad, justified or unjustified. To give another example of why we need the distinction, consider stage magic for entertainment purposes. Persuasion techniques are used extensively in magic acts. They're fundamental to the practice. But in the context of stage magic, the manipulations and deceptions are used to delight and entertain us, not to exploit or hurt us. Intentions and goals matter to our assessment of these cases. We don't condemn stage magic or mentalist acts simply because they use mind control techniques. But when the very same techniques are used to con or scam people out of money, we rightly condemn the practice as unethical. So let's agree that we can imagine cases where what I'm calling mind control is unobjectionable, and we can imagine cases where it's deeply objectionable. Now, if you bring up the topic of mind control in the context of interpersonal relationships, I guarantee you're going to divide people. But I think the questions that naturally arise in these situations are important ones, and they'll push us to think harder about when using these techniques is acceptable and when it's not. So now I'm going to describe 3 scenarios, 3 different descriptions of an interaction between a man and a woman named Derek and Carla. I want you to think about your own responses to what's going on as I describe these scenarios. Okay, here's the first one. Derek is a young man preparing to meet a young woman, Carla, for a lunch date. He was introduced to her briefly at a party the previous night. He likes her, and he wants to make a good impression. Derek takes time to shower and shave and style his hair, pick a nice, flattering shirt. He greets Carla outside the restaurant, holds the door open for her, and they go inside. Derek compliments Carla on her shoes. As they wait for a server, he begins a conversation about the most recent episode of Game of Thrones, which he had overheard Carla discussing at the party. They talk about their mutual appreciation for the show and various theories for how the story will unfold. Derek asks Carla several leading questions about her background and interests and shares a humorous story about a mutual friend. Overall, the two have an enjoyable and engaging lunch date. So what do you think about Derek's overall conduct in this scenario? Positive? Negative? Neutral? Now let's consider another version of this story. This is scenario 2. Derek is a young man preparing to meet a young woman, Carla, for a lunch date. He was introduced to her briefly at a party the previous night. He likes her and wants to make a good impression. Derek has recently finished reading Dale Carnegie's classic book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, first published in 1936. He is also familiar with social psychologist Robert Cialdini's seminal work on persuasion and influence, summarized in his 2001 book, Influence, Science and Practice. Dale Carnegie has a section in his book titled 6 Ways to Make People Like You. I'm going to read you his 6 rules. Rule number 1, become genuinely interested in other people. Rule number 2, smile. Rule number 3, remember that a person's name is to him or her the sweetest and most important sound. Rule number 4, be a good listener. Encourage others to talk about themselves. Rule number 5, talk in terms of the other person's interests. And rule number 6, make the other person feel important and do it sincerely. Now let's take a look inside Robert Cialdini's book. Robert Cialdini's book surveys 6 proven principles of persuasion. One of these is the principle of liking. People are more easily persuaded by people who they like. His chapter on liking discusses factors that can cause us to like someone. Here's his list. Number 1, physical attractiveness. Quote, research has shown that we automatically assign to good-looking individuals such favorable traits as talent, kindness, honesty, and intelligence. Number 2, similarity. We like people who are similar to us. This fact seems to hold true whether the similarity is in the area of opinions, personality traits, background, or lifestyle. Number 3, compliments. We tend, as a rule, to believe praise and to like those who provide it, even oftentimes when it is clearly false. Number 4, contact and cooperation. Becoming familiar with something through repeated contact doesn't necessarily cause greater liking. We must also be working for the same goals. We must pull together for mutual benefit. Number 5, conditioning and association. Compliance professionals are incessantly trying to connect themselves or their products with the things we like. Do you ever wonder what all those good-looking models are doing standing around in those automobile ads? Okay, those are the quotes from Cialdini's book. Now, in this scenario, we're assuming that Derek is familiar with all of these principles, both the Carnegie principles and the Cialdini principles. He wants Carla to like him, and he sees that some of them can be applied to his upcoming date. So, Derek does a quick Google search of Carla and finds her profile on Facebook. He skims through her entries and notes some of the topics that she mentions or likes. He makes note of a link that she shared on Game of Thrones theories, and he reads the associated story. And now Derek plans his date with Carla. He thinks through how he wants to present himself and how the conversation should go. Clean up, remember to smile, compliment her shoes, share a funny story, bring up Game of Thrones, pay attention, and listen. Now, another thing that Derek knows from his reading is that physiological arousal in human beings can be triggered by dilated pupils. Pupils dilate during sexual arousal, and experiments show that seeing someone with dilated pupils can trigger a mirroring physiological response, which can make the person with the dilated pupils appear more attractive to you. Now, under dimmer lighting, our pupils naturally widen, and Derek knows this. When he and Carla enter the restaurant, he looks for a booth that is more dimly lit and leads her there, hoping that he will benefit from the pupil dilation response over the course of their lunch date. And from here, the remainder of the lunch date unfolds as described in scenario 1. Now, what do you think about Derek's overall conduct in this scenario? Is it any different from the version described in scenario 1? Well, the common response when I present these scenarios is that almost everyone has no problem with scenario 1. In fact, Derek's conduct on this date seems admirable to many people. One friend of mine said, "I only wish my son had social skills like that." By contrast, many people have a strong reaction to scenario 2. They believe there is something objectionable about Derek's attitude and behavior as he prepares for his date with Carla. Here are some written quotes from a survey I gave at a talk when I presented this case. Number 1. Derek Googling Carla to get information on her that he can use to his advantage. That's just creepy. Number 2. In the second scenario, it doesn't seem like Derek is treating Carla like a person. He's treating her like an object that he can manipulate to get what he wants. Number 3. He's being intentionally manipulative. He's fooling her into thinking they're having a spontaneous, genuine conversation when it's really not. Number 4. Derek is running a pickup artist playbook, and I find it all offensive. However, not everyone was so judgmental. Here's quote number 5. There's nothing wrong with learning how human behavior works and applying that knowledge. Why not use what you know to your advantage? Here's number 6. We plan conversations in our heads all the time when we anticipate talking to someone and we're a little bit anxious about it. I do that practically every time I walk into a faculty meeting. Here's number 7. If we can assume that Derek isn't intentionally lying to her about anything just to get her to like him, and is genuinely interested in Carla as a person, I don't see a problem with any of this. Well, I find this range of responses fascinating. They point to something important about how we view ourselves and how we want to view ourselves. And what exactly this is something I'm going to return to in later episodes. And just to add a new spin to the discussion, I want you to consider this third scenario. Scenario 3. Derek has had difficulty all his life with social skills and reading people. He often failed to pick up on social cues, and that led to frustration and isolation. Derek has been diagnosed as operating at the high functional end of the autistic spectrum, closer to Asperger's. As a highly intelligent teenager, Derek decided to undertake a study of human social behavior with the goal of cracking the code of normal human social interaction. He read self-help and psychology books. He kept notebooks in which he wrote down the patterns he found that were associated with pro-social behaviors. He wrote out checklists of what to do or consider in different scenarios, and he worked hard at practicing these skills. Over time, Derek's social skills improved dramatically, and he learned to function well with other people, acquire and maintain friends, and so on. But because of the way Derek's brain works, he still has to anticipate and plan social interactions in a more conscious and deliberate way than most people. He hasn't internalized these principles in the intuitive, unconscious way that most people do. At the party, Derek noticed Carla and was attracted to her. He wanted to ask her out, but he was naturally anxious about this prospect. To prepare, he consciously implemented some of the social strategies he had learned based on his research and experience. And the rest of the date plays out as described in scenario 2. Now, what do you think about Derek? Is he still a manipulative creep, or are you less judgmental of his behavior? Well, almost everyone I ask, when given this third scenario, is more understanding and sympathetic to Derek. Here are some more quotes from that survey. Number 1. Now, I wouldn't describe him as manipulative. Actually, there's something charming about how hard he's trying to impress Carla. Number 2. The difference for me is now we understand his underlying motives better. He's had to struggle to learn social skills that the rest of us take for granted, and this is just his way of compensating. Number 3. I still don't like the pupil arousal thing. I still find that weirdly manipulative, but I don't have as much of an issue with him planning out the date in the way that he did. So, what do you think of these cases? What do you think they tell us about the factors that matter to us when it comes to judging what forms of mind control are acceptable and what forms are not? I'm going to pick this up next episode, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this. You can leave comments for this show at argumentninja.com, episode 3. Now, as an epilogue to this episode, I want to add that my description of Derek in scenario 3, where he struggles with learning social skills and has to teach himself to be more deliberate and self-conscious about his interactions with other people, that description is based on a real guy that I came across who wrote a real book on this very topic. His name is Daniel Wendler, and you can watch him talk about his journey in a TEDx talk on YouTube. I'll link to it in the show notes, but if you go to YouTube and search for My Life with Asperger's and Daniel Wendler, you'll find it. Here's a short clip from that talk.
I remember my psychologist gave me a list of the social skills that people with Asperger's struggle with, and I was like, oh, all right, let's get to work. And so I started studying social skills. I started reading books on body language, conversation, etiquette, you name it. I started watching movies with my parents where I would pause the movie like 10 times to be like, hey, what just happened in that conversation? Hey, I don't understand why this character did that. Hey, explain these social cues to me. And I started to get better. And it started to make sense. I started being able to figure out the systems that govern the way that people interact. And I started being able to create metaphors and ideas to help me know how to respond. Like, let's talk about body language. My favorite is that feet signal intent. So if somebody's talking to you and their feet are pointing right at you, it means that they're very focused in on talking with you. Whereas if they're talking to you and their feet are pointed towards the door, they want to go. And so you should probably let them end the conversation.
Now, I think there are real lessons to be learned from this example, but I'll save that for another episode. So, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.